This is Talk to Seattle, and I'm your host, Jason Rigdon. On this episode, we have Tim Ellis from the Seattle Bubble. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you.
So, could you tell me about this website?
Yeah, Seattle Bubble. So I started it back in 2005 when anyone who's been around for that long might remember that the real estate market was pretty crazy back then. Similar to the way it's felt the last few years, actually. But of course, we all know how it turned out. Turns out there was a giant housing bubble, and it all burst very spectacularly, took down the whole economy, all that. But in 2005, there was a lot of uncertainty about, was this hot housing market, was it real? Was it, founded on solid fundamentals, that kind of thing? And I really was just looking to buy a house. I knew nothing about real estate. My background is electrical engineering, and I wanted to buy a house, but the market was crazy. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to figure out what the heck is going on with the market. And, in 2005, blogging was still newish, popular-ish, I guess. And so I thought, I'm doing all this research, gathering all this data. I may as well put it on a blog, because I found out there was, in my research, I found a handful of sort of national blogs that were focusing on the question of, is there a housing bubble at the time? And there were a few local ones in places like Phoenix or San Diego, but there was nothing in the Seattle area. So I figured I may as well start the blog. And it was sort of this voice in the wilderness type of thing, because at the time there was a lot of real estate blogs in Seattle that were run by local real estate agents. So they were, very, rah-rah, cheerleader, nothing's wrong, rose-colored glasses kind of stuff, very, very sales pitchy. But my blog was sort of much more pragmatic and like, let's look at the data and see what's going on. So it was, just kind of snowballed from there. Never really marketed the blog or anything like that, but it's kind of grew organically because a lot of other people had the same sort of questions about what was going on in the market. And when everything kind of crashed, all of a sudden I was the local expert that was the only one locally who had really been pointing all these things out.
Yeah, when you first started, how did people in real estate react to you? I remember like a lot of hostility towards you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anyone who is in the real estate industry, well, not anyone, but most of the people in the real estate industry were very hostile, up to and including just open mockery. There was one agent who I'm not going to name necessarily, but he was making like these posts on his blog that were just really openly mocking me by name and my site, and like just calling me names and implying that I was, childish or stupid or whatever else. Turns out he doesn't really blog anymore. I'm not sure if he's in real estate at all anymore, but yeah, most of the sort of traditional real estate agents were very hostile to the concept of anyone suggesting that there might be something like a housing bubble, even though I was never saying, we were going to see markets crash the same way in Seattle that they were likely to in Phoenix. I was just saying something's wrong, like there's going to be a correction. And just suggesting that at all was just like heresy to most of the real estate industry. The one big exception to that was Redfin. And I got to know some of the people at Redfin through my blog, and eventually ended up working there. And I'm actually back there again now. So, little side plug, I guess.
So you've been doing this blog for a long time, much longer than most people have been. Most blogs don't last this long. Like, what's kept you motivated all this time?
Well, at the beginning, obviously, it was sort of motivated by a drive to figure out what the heck was going on in the market. I felt like I got a good handle on that. And then it shifted to a motivation of like, well, let's watch and see when this all comes crumbling down. And then, in 2008, that really happened in force. And then it was sort of, for a few years there, it was like the motivation shifted from at that point to sort of more of a, well, let's see how far this is going to go. Let's, really try to figure out like, when are things going to hit the bottom? Because that turned into kind of a fun game during the bust. It wasn't a fun time in general, but for the blog, it was kind of a fun game to sort of figure out like, when is the market really going to hit bottom, and to kind of poke fun at the real estate agents who said literally every single month it was the bottom. And, eventually we did kind of hit the bottom in early 2012, and things started rebounding, and I called it around that time. And I think there were a handful of other bloggers who were doing similar things to me who also were all kind of calling the same thing. Calculated Risk is a national blog that focuses on economic data and stuff like that. And he called the bottom right around the same time. And we were right. And the market started rebounding. And then for a while it was, again, the motivation kind of shifted to like, okay, well, let's see like what's this recovery going to look like? And that's actually one instance where I was definitely off base. I really thought that it was going to be more of a slow recovery, just kind of a steady climb out from the bottom. But things kind of like rebounded really sharply, a lot more sharply than I expected. And honestly, actually, the last 3 or 4 years have been, I wouldn't say I've lost motivation because obviously I've still been maintaining the blog, but I've been posting a lot less frequently for a while. And that's because up until about a year ago, it was like 3 or 4 years of just the same thing. Like, yep, the market rebounded really sharply. Prices are skyrocketing. There's very few listings, a ton of competition. Like if you're trying to buy a home, it sucks. Like that was the story like every month for 3 years. There was just like no change, and it started to get really boring following the housing market and just kind of like unfortunate. I mean, for myself, we actually did end up buying a home in 2011, about 6 months before prices bottomed out. So, I did pretty good as far as that goes, but my interest in maintaining the blog has always been not just for my own personal benefit to try and time to market or whatever, but really is more of like an educational thing to like help other people who don't necessarily have the time or the resources or the expertise to really understand what's going on in the housing market, to have a place where they can come and sort of like see like high level what's going on. And, just got really frustrating there from like, I'd say about 2015 to 2018, early 2018, like in those years, it was just like, the market kind of sucks unless you have a home to sell and you're going to move out of the area and not try to buy another home. Like this market is just unfortunate for everybody. And in the last year or so, it's actually started to turn and get a little more interesting. Things have been softening up, like more homes are coming on the market. And that actually has coincided with my return to Redfin. So it's kind of fun because I'm not only blogging about the local real estate market here in Seattle on my blog, which is still completely my own thing, independent, but I'm also able to now have access to sort of like the national data and compare like, well, how does Seattle compare to all these other markets around the country? Because Redfin has the data in San Francisco and San Diego and New York and Phoenix and Chicago and all these areas that are every housing market is kind of acting very differently right now. And there's some interesting trends as far as that goes where, when you're just looking at Seattle, you may have like a certain perception of the market that's not entirely complete. It's a very different situation, I feel like now to what it was, 10 years ago, or I guess 11 years ago now, like before the market collapsed, where it was like every single market was overheated. Whereas now it seems like there's some markets that are actually kind of still heating up and other markets that have kind of cooled off a bit. And Seattle's sort of more in that latter category. So it's kind of becoming an interesting time again to really try to like parse out what's happening. And that's really what motivates me is like that it's just interesting. Like even if I'm not interested in buying another house or selling my own house, just what's going on in the market like is an interesting thing. And it's fun to kind of try to decipher that for people.
Another thing you're pretty well known for is those amazing charts. How do you make those charts and decide what data to like use?
Well, I mean, a lot of the charts I've spent, over a decade now kind of refining. And certainly when I go back and look at a lot of the stuff that I posted 10, 12 years ago, I feel like stuff that I posted back then that I thought looked really good, I am kind of embarrassed of now. But I'm almost all the charts that I post in there are literally just Excel. And it's just sort of, I've spent a lot of time playing around in Excel and really like playing with a lot of, almost none of the settings are default. I'm doing a lot of kind of tweaking of the colors and the line shapes and all this kind of stuff to really make something that I think paints a real clear picture of what's going on. That's my goal anyway. Hopefully I kind of accomplish that some of the time.
Yeah, I mean, you really have elevated it to an art form.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I do. Like I said, I do. It is something that I try to put a lot of effort into, is like making the charts nice and informative and clear. And like I said, I try not to use sort of the Excel defaults, which don't necessarily put out something that looks all that great.
You get a lot of comments on your posts. How do you handle those comments? Sometimes they're quite hostile.
Yeah. It used to be back in the, 10 years ago, I used to read every single comment that was posted on there. I do not have the time for that anymore. And I have generally a pretty hands-off policy. I do have a policy of, if somebody's being just really outright hostile and name calling and just kind of over the top, I'll delete comments, or I have gone as far in the past as to just completely block people's access to leave comments and stuff like that. But generally, my sort of philosophy is, theoretically, we're all adults and we can, have a conversation without getting completely, personal and nasty about it. But yeah, there's definitely some heated discussions in there, but I feel like for the most part, it's I've seen places where things can really spiral out of control on the internet, and I feel like even though sometimes things get a little heated and hostile, maybe it's not generally it's not too bad.
Do you think we learned anything from the 2008 real estate crash?
I hope so. I definitely feel like the general perception is a lot different now than it was pre the crash. There's less of a sense of, I think, for a lot of people, of like, I have to buy a house no matter what. Buying a house is the best thing in all situations, because it's not like I'm obviously pro real estate. I own a house. I work for a real estate company. I think homeownership has a lot of advantages, but I think that the crash did sort of instill a sense in a lot of people of like, well, maybe it's not always the best idea to buy a house no matter what. If you're gonna have to stretch your budget too far or get into, too risky of a loan to buy a house, maybe you shouldn't. Or if it's a place that you're not planning on staying for, 5 years, 7 years, maybe you should think about not buying. And I think that some of those lessons certainly have kind of stuck after the bust, because it seems like, even though the market is really hot again, it's sort of a very different underpinning than it was, 12 years ago, when things were crazy and everybody was getting, really dangerous loans and stuff like that. Like we're seeing a little bit of that start to creep back in, but so far it seems like people are doing a lot better job. And by people, I don't just mean like individual home buyers, but like institutions and stuff like that are doing a much better job, I think, of being more prudent now than they were, before the previous bust. I think it's sort of shattered the illusion that it's okay to make any kind of risky bet you want on housing, whether that's, again, at the individual level or at an institutional level, because house prices always go up. That was sort of, I feel like, the fantasy, the fictional belief prior to the bust was that it doesn't matter how dangerous your investment is if it's with real estate, because home prices always go up. And I feel like that's the one thing that people don't necessarily just take for granted anymore, is that they understand that home prices could stop going up. They could even slip a little bit, and people are making decisions that are informed by that knowledge. At least I hope.
For many people, there's been a big change in maybe like the last 10, 20 years where, home ownership used to be kind of expected. And now for a lot of folks, especially renters, it feels like it's unattainable. Do you think that that's had any effect on the region as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like Seattle is an area in particular that, one of the things we used to joke about on the site during the last, bubble before things bust was a lot of the people who thought there was no real estate bubble would basically make all these arguments about ways that Seattle was somehow special and unique and different from every other market, and that there was no housing bubble in Seattle, even if there was in other markets. And at the time, we made fun of that a lot. And I think that was justified to make fun of, because it was kind of a ridiculous thing back at the time. But really, honestly, in the last 10 years, and I think driven largely by Amazon, but also, all the other tech that's been setting up here, both locally and, outposts from the Bay Area. The Seattle market really has kind of changed, like fundamentally, from a market where like somebody who's not making, well into the six figures in tech can could afford to buy a home, 10 years ago or, 20 years ago. And now it feels like it's not as much of an attainable thing. You really have to be making like a lot of money if you want to buy a home, certainly anywhere in the city proper. And it's even kind of like the prices have gone up quite a bit, even, in the rest of King County and Snohomish and Pierce even. I mean, right now I live up in Everett, and I feel like the homes that I'm seeing selling in my neighborhood are going for like double what I paid just 8 years ago. And that, to me, that seems kind of crazy. And yeah, it definitely feels like sort of a shift in the mindset of what's attainable in this area specifically. And I feel like that's not necessarily the case everywhere. There's a lot of places where you can afford to buy a home on a more modest income if you're not, like I said, working in tech, making six figures, et cetera. But yeah, in Seattle area specifically, like there has been kind of a shift because the economy has just like sort of shifted so heavily into this very, very tech driven sector. And yeah, I don't necessarily know that it's for the better. I kind of do miss the time when you could afford to buy a home without having to be sort of in that elite industry. But it's yeah, it is what it is now, I guess.
Well, I definitely see in city politics in Seattle, this really clear divide that I see of homeowners and renters. And I think that's kind of one of the reasons why this, city council race has become so polarized. It's this, they're so far apart.
Yeah, definitely. There's and it seems like in a lot of scenarios, the people who own homes in Seattle, I think a pretty good percentage of them still are probably people who have owned homes for decades. And so you have, I think in a lot of cases, almost like a generational gap there as well, where the homeowners tend to be from the, the older generations, and the renters tend to be from the younger generations. And they obviously have very different priorities, not just when it comes to, sort of real estate concerns, but all kinds of concerns. And yeah, that's definitely a growing divide, I think, in the Seattle area for sure.
So you're an expert on Seattle real estate, and there's a question that, comes up quite a bit, and maybe you can shed some light on it, of does Seattle or the Seattle area have a problem with foreign buyers coming in and buying real estate as an investment, but not necessarily to live in?
Yeah, the foreign buyer thing has been an interesting question. It's something that I was hearing a lot about a few years ago, and I feel like the problem is I've looked into it a few times, and there's nobody really has any like hard quantifiable data on that question, because it's sort of there's not some sort of registration you have to do when you buy a home. You can't really know just by looking at public records, whether the buyer of a home is from around here or from a different state or from a different country. And so it's mostly speculation and anecdote based. And just basing it on sort of that, the trend seemed to peak a few years ago. And in the last year or so, since the market has kind of cooled, I haven't really heard anywhere near as much about that issue particularly. And maybe that's part of why the market in the Seattle area has cooled, is partly because the interest from some of these out of country buyers has dried up a little bit. But, I never really felt like it was that big of a factor on the market. But on the flip side, the thing is, when you have a market that's as tight as ours has been, where there's been so few homes for sale, it doesn't take that much to really like of pressure in a particular area to really move the needle kind of dramatically when it comes to things like prices. So, it could have been an issue. I don't think it's really much of an issue anymore. And
do you think we're in a bubble right now?
I still wouldn't call what's going on right now in the Seattle market a bubble. Like I mentioned earlier, it feels like the underlying fundamentals are very different than they were, 12 years ago before the previous bubble burst. We don't have people buying homes on just fantasy financing, the so-called ninja loans, no job, no income, no assets, that kind of stuff is gone. In fact, a large percentage of the homes are actually still being bought with cash. And I don't have the exact number on that, like right in front of me, but it's a number larger than you would think. It's not like single digit percentage of the homes that are bought with cash. It's like in the double digit percentages still, I believe. And so I don't think that we can really say like, oh, we're definitely in a bubble. Certainly not the kind of a bubble that we would expect to see, like a giant dramatic crash like we saw before. I do think we have seen things kind of take a pause and sort of flatten out a bit over the last year. And we started to see this actually about a year ago, a little less than a year ago, was when I first started to notice something was changing in the market. And that was specifically that a lot more homes were coming on the market than we had seen in previous years. And that trend has continued for about a year now, where we were at like crazy record low inventory levels in early 2018. Number of homes on the market was like rock bottom. And we've bounced back quite a bit from there, which is, really great news for like sort of cooling things off a little bit. But even though we've seen that really bounce back up quite a bit, we're still, when you look at sort of like the balance between the number of homes for sale and the number of people that are out there buying homes, like it's still really a seller's market. So I don't think that we're likely to see it suddenly and dramatically shift to a buyer's market anytime soon, unfortunately, because I would love to see that. But it doesn't feel like a bubble to me. It just feels like there's just still a lot of demand. Now, what we may see, there's the big question, I think, is what's going on in the economy as a whole, the greater, high level economy. Are we going to see a recession, and what might happen to the real estate market when a recession hits? Because eventually we're going to have another recession. And that's sort of the big question to me. Like, do we see things just sort of like pause for a few years and home prices just kind of flatline, or do they drop a little bit? Even if they do, I don't really see prices dropping more than like maybe 10%, but even that like seems like a lot at this point. So I don't know. It's hard to say.
And how can people support your work?
Well, right now I do have a sort of a membership thing going on Seattle Bubble. It's kind of a do your own Patreon type of deal that people can basically support my work on a monthly basis or on a yearly basis. And we have sort of like an insider club, basically, where we've got a private Slack channel, and I share my like spreadsheets with everybody who's on the membership list. They can just open up the raw spreadsheets, not just, the image charts or whatever, and see all the underlying data that I'm using to, kind of track what's going on in the market, and have a direct line to me through the Slack channel and that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's on my site. There's a little subscribe link on the sidebar. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Of course. Thank you.
You've been listening to Talk to Seattle. I've been your host, Jason Rigdon. If you want to support the show, why don't you follow us on social media? We're at Talk to Seattle on Twitter and Instagram. Thank you for listening.